Hi, this is Josh Carlisle, and thanks for joining me on Azure Elements. In this episode, which is likely going to be the first of a small series, we're going to be digging into some more details around Azure Static Web Apps. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why should I care? How is this going to change my world? Well, if you're building modern web applications today, and you're using client-side frameworks talking to server-side APIs, then this should absolutely be of interest to you. It's also worth mentioning that this is actually a preview feature on Azure, and what that means is we could see some changes over time before this goes to GA. It's also worth mentioning that I actually recorded this episode 2 weeks ago. And what that means is in the last couple of weeks, there's actually been some very interesting tidbits coming from other members of the community, and I'm going to include those along the way in the video as well. Now, if you find this video helpful, I'd appreciate a like. If you want to be notified when there are new episodes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. But let's go ahead and learn some more about Azure Static Web Apps. So before we go into some details around Azure Static Web Apps, I first wanted to share a recent experience of mine where I had the opportunity to actually use Azure Static Web Apps on a personal project. So one of my loves outside technology is actually photography. Photography is kind of a pressure release valve for me. And I actually have 15, 20 years of portfolio photos sitting around on drives. Now, until a couple years ago, I actually had them hosted up on Squarespace that I was paying the 20, 30 bucks a month or whatever it was for. And I kind of let it go to the wayside. I didn't want to pay that bill anymore. But recently, I've had some friends and family inquire about, hey, wouldn't it be great to see some of your photography online again? Now, I've also seen a lot of buzz on social media and Twitter around Azure Static Web Apps. And I thought, you know what? Wouldn't this be a great opportunity to maybe kind of kick the tires a bit, take it for a spin, see how it turned out? Well, I had such a fantastic experience around it that I decided to actually make this series around working with Azure Static Web Apps. Now, what you're looking at in front of you right now is actually my personal blog. It's joshcarlisle.com. Now, this is nothing super impressive, right? But what is actually kind of impressive about this is it took me an afternoon. Right? And most of that afternoon was actually working on learning a new client-side framework, which I'll be talking about momentarily. But I was so impressed with being able to do this in an afternoon, I thought, you know what? I'm going to share this online, but instead of actually just sharing how to use Azure Static Web Apps and going down through the documentation and doing some sample stuff, why don't we actually do a real-world scenario? So I also have my personal blog, joshcarlisle.io. And as you can see here, my last post is June 8th, 2018. So it's been totally neglected, right? I'm horrible with my blog. But I thought, with COVID going on these days and the fact that I'm probably stuck in these walls for quite a few more months, this would be a really great opportunity to reboot my blog and share a little bit about that process along the way. So for this episode, the next few episodes, probably going to be 2 or 3 at least, we're actually going to go through that process. I'm going to spin up joshcarlisle.io. I'm going to share how I'm making the decisions, what choices I'm making, why I'm making those choices, and along the way, we're going to learn a bunch about working with Azure's Static Web Apps. So let's start by level setting a little bit about what Azure Static Web Apps is. So at the end of the day, Azure Static Web Apps is a service that provides for the build, the deploy, and the hosting of modern full-stack web applications. I think this diagram represents things pretty well. So first off, we have our source control that resides in GitHub. When someone does a pull or push request, meaning they're updating their website in some fashion or form, we have a GitHub action that's fired. That GitHub action is provided for us by Azure Static Web Apps, and we'll see that in action here shortly. It is also responsible for deploying all of our bits out to Azure. So when I say bits, we're talking about our HTML, our JavaScript, our CSS, our static content, right? Now, we can't have a full stack solution without having some sort of server-side API. Azure Static Web Apps actually makes use of my favorite serverless platform, which is Azure Functions, for hosting those APIs. And then all of that stuff is all deployed globally. Now, one of the things I like to mention is these are actually building blocks. And I say they're building blocks because for those of you already familiar with Azure, some of this stuff may already look familiar, right? Most of these elements you can do today in Azure, but you have to do them all independently. You have to configure everything yourself. So the magic of what really Azure Static Web Apps is the seamless way it wraps all of this together and makes it really, really easy, right? Easy enough where someone who had no familiarity with this platform in an afternoon got a blog and a website up and running, right? So at this point in time, you probably at least have a couple questions. I know I did already at this point in time. So one of my first questions was GitHub, right? Huge fan of GitHub, love GitHub, but I know from my customer standpoint, we're not always on GitHub. I have customers on Azure DevOps, customers on their platforms. Can we use those other platforms? Well, the answer right now is no. Could that change in the future? We'll see. I hope so. I hope we can at least support Azure DevOps. But I know probably the kink in that plan is the GitHub action, right? So part of this will likely have to be re-architected to support whatever other platform it is. GitHub actions are a little bit different than Azure DevOps actions. So I don't know. Hopefully we'll see. It would be great to have a little bit more flexibility, at least with Azure DevOps here. Now, my second natural question was, it says static content right here. Can I deploy my ASP.NET apps? Can I deploy my Java apps here? The answer is no, we cannot. This has to be a client-side solution. This has to be static content. My next question was Azure Functions, love them, right? But I also know, based on my experience with Azure Functions, there's lots and lots of languages available. Are there any restrictions to me, right, of what language I can build my serverless APIs in? Well, if we scroll down to the bottom here, we'll start to get a few hints on what we're restricted to, at least during preview, right? You got to remember this is preview, so things can always change. There can be new stuff here, and Microsoft is fantastic at taking feedback and having platforms evolve over time. So don't get upset if you don't see your framework of choice here. I'm sure you'll probably see a lot of stuff grow over here over time. But right now we have Angular, React, Svelte, Vue. And with an Azure Functions, it doesn't say here, it's another separate piece of the document, but Azure Functions, at least in the documentation, states we only can do things in Node. I hope that doesn't remain true. I am fine with Node. I can do Node development. I'm happy doing JavaScript, did JavaScript for years. But, you know, being a .NET guy since the beginning of .NET, that's kind of where I like to gravitate towards, my happy place. And so it would be great to be able to see Azure Static Web Apps support the full breadth of languages that are available on Azure Functions, whether you want to do Python or Java or whatever you want to do, whatever we support, PowerShell, I guess, right? I won't judge. But right now we're restricted to just Node. Not the end of the world. You know, a lot of full stack developers, they're doing Node across the whole stack, right? Or they're doing JavaScript, right? Client side and server side, right? Now, from a static website generator standpoint, they support Gatsby, Hugo, and ViewPress. Now, at the end of the day, I ended up choosing to go with Hugo. And I'll talk about why in a moment here, but that's just one of the options I chose. Now, what's missing a little bit here, and I'm actually a little bit disappointed it's missing, is I don't see Blazor here. So for those not familiar with Blazor, Blazor is an ASP.NET framework that essentially runs in the browser, right? So that was overly dumbing it down. I'm sure some Blazor person is going to correct me on that. But I've worked just enough with Blazor to actually enjoy it, right? So I'm a little bit surprised that I don't see that in here. It falls in the client side, although there is a server side version of it. So hopefully, I don't know, knock on wood, we'll see Blazor here soon as well, because it only makes sense to be here. So before I leave this page and we start digging into some of my own decision making and what we're going to be doing here, starting to make some decisions about building out my new blog, I did want to call out some of those key features because they really are some of the building blocks, right? So we talked already about the web hosting and the Azure Functions API and the GitHub integration, but what makes this also interesting is the turnkey, global distribution. Once again, we can do that today. We can deploy to multiple regions. We can do some front door stuff. We can do some very interesting things. But this comes automatically out of the box for us, right? So we can make sure that customers, users of our website are having a good experience regardless of where they are in the world, right? You can't beat the speed of light. So that global distribution, free SSL certificates, custom domains. I already have a custom domain set up. An actual security model, right? We can integrate security in with this. We can do back-end routing rules. There's actually the ability to do staging environments, right? So if you do a pull request and you want to be able to do a preview of a site before you approve it, Azure Static Web Apps handles all of that. So there are a lot of really, really valuable building blocks all baked into this solution. But let's go ahead and step back now that you've kind of gotten the overview of where Static Web Apps lives. And by this point in time, you can probably decide whether this interests you or not. Let's start digging a little bit into some of the other details. So one of the first important decisions you have to make is choosing a client-side framework. Now, I want to preface this whole discussion with the fact that you can absolutely have success with every single one of these, right? sometimes client-side framework discussions border on religious discussions, right? So I'm not going to go down that direction, but I'm going to tell you what my experience is and why I made the decision I made. Now, my background historically is server-side solutions. ASP.NET Forms back in the day, ASP.NET MVC more recently, and I actually spent a couple years working on your traditional client-side framework, starting with AngularJS and getting into more of the modern Angular stack. I actually spent some time in SharePoint land working with React. Had a good experience with all of those, despite some of the challenges you often have on JavaScript client-side frameworks. But at the end of the day, my decision was largely based on the fact that I wanted something easy, right? I wanted that easy button. I didn't want to add a lot of complexity. I don't need a lot of complexity. This is static blog content, right? So I don't really have a need for some of the overhead and some of the complexity that comes with these client-side JavaScript framework, application frameworks. So I became a little bit interested in these static site generators, right? Now, I'd never used any of these things before, so I went out and asked some friends, and they were like, yeah, check out Gatsby.js and, check out Hugo. And I was like, okay, and so I went and checked those out. Now, at the end of the day, I decided going the Hugo route. And the reason was kind of silly, but, it worked for me. I tried Gatsby first. And when I did an NPM update, the first thing I got was deprecation warnings. So if you've ever dealt with JavaScript client-side frameworks, you know you have to deal a lot with NPM and package dependencies. And I just didn't want to go down this route, right? You could absolutely have success. I'm sure I could have had success with Gatsby. But I decided to go Hugo instead, right? So Hugo's based on Go, and it didn't really feel Go. I know a little bit of Go, but it's just a templating language. It's simple, it works, it's fast. And that's really what I wanted, and that kind of drove my decision. But to be clear, you can absolutely have success with all of these, right? Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Hugo. This is not intended to be a Hugo tutorial. I probably wouldn't give a great Hugo tutorial with my vast amount of experience over a couple days. But you will see a little bit of an action because it's important to see kind of that whole life cycle, right? So going forward here in a few minutes, we're going to start spinning up a Hugo site, and we're going to start getting that into GitHub, and we're going to start kind of configuring things and seeing what that process is for getting up and running with Azure Static Web Apps. So one quick last comment in regards to Blazor. If we are lucky enough to see Blazor included in the Azure Static Web App feature set, you can definitely count on me circling back around and reapproaching this discussion, or at the very least showing off a little bit about how we can integrate with Blazor. We can kind of keep our fingers crossed, won't we? Let's go ahead and continue on. So I've already gone ahead and spun up a blank Hugo site. If you're curious how to do that yourself, you can find some really good documentation on the Azure Static Websites documentation under Tutorials and Published from Static Site Generator and Hugo. As you can see, it's actually pretty simple. Once you get the CLI installed, it's just as simple as running Hugo new site name. So you're really not missing very much by me not demoing that sequence. But if we do go ahead and jump over to Visual Studio Code, we can actually see the site itself. Now, this is a pretty blank site, not a lot of content. I haven't put anything in here yet from my existing blog. I do have an initial post there that I've just placed in here. You'll notice that it's an MD extension, which is Markdown. One of the things I like about static site generators, and I think this is probably common, although I'm not sure, at least as it is in Hugo, is to use Markdown for your content. I'm a big fan of Markdown. I like working with Markdown. If you're curious about some of the syntactic sugar that you're seeing in the top here, I definitely encourage you to take a look at Hugo and Hugo documentation. It goes into a lot of details and demystify all of this. Now, before we go ahead and try to wire in our Azure Static Web App into this site, I want to go ahead and test it first. It's always a good idea to test it first. So I'm going to use the Hugo CLI and do a Hugo server switch D, and that's just going to spin up a nice little local instance so that I can see this in action before we go ahead and start working with it. One of the things you notice is it's really lightning fast. So let's go ahead and open up this link just to make sure that the site's actually working. There we go. Okay, so pretty basic, right? Nothing special here. The one thing is I do plan on circling back here while and before I publish the second episode and actually kind of get out to Squarespace and figure out the way that I'm going to pull all of that existing data I have over on Squarespace, which you can actually kind of see here, right? And try to get it into my Hugo site. I don't know what that's looked like, but the more that I think about it now, if you do have some interest in seeing that, go ahead and leave a comment and maybe I'll record that. Once again, I'm hoping there's an existing tool out there. If not, I might have to build something a little bit myself to kind of suck in that content, but we'll see how it goes. But now we know that it's working. It's time to go ahead and switch gears, and let's go ahead and look at our GitHub repo. Now, I've already gone ahead, just to save a little bit of time, and published this out to joshcarlisle.io. So I have my GitHub repo. Nothing really special in there. It's just a GitHub repo. But let's go ahead and jump over to Azure. Now, I'm in the Azure portal. We're going to create a new Azure Static Web App instance through the Azure portal. Now, of course, I'm going to use the portal. It's all UI based, a lot of point and clicking, great for demos. If you're more into automation, you can of course do this through the Azure CLI or use an ARM template, right? But we're going to go ahead and add a new resource onto here. So I'm going to choose Add. I'm going to choose Static Web App. And if you notice, it's giving you the warning, hey, we're in preview, right? So let's go ahead and create this. Now, we're given just a few options here. I already have a resource group, that's where I want it. We're going to go ahead and choose a static web app name. Now, this isn't a name it has to be globally unique like you would expect from Azure Functions or if you're using Azure App Services. This is an arbitrary name, it's kind of like a label here. So we're just going to go ahead and call this joshcarlisle-io, right? Now, we're going to go ahead and pick a region here. Now, we're limited today to Central US, East US 2, East Asia, West Europe, and West US 2. I'm fully expecting once this goes GA to be available in more regions. I'm on the East Coast of the United States, so I'm going to go ahead and pick East US 2. Now, this is the part where we have some tie-in with GitHub. So I need to authenticate into GitHub, and I need to be able to select the repo that I want to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in with GitHub. Now, you might have just seen a quick flash there. Your experience is probably going to be a little different. If you have never been to connecting up to GitHub and authenticating to GitHub, you're going to get the login response there. I've already done that, so it's pretty quick. Now, you'll notice one of my favorite features of Azure Static Web Apps is this one right here. It's free, right? So I'm hoping it stays free. I don't know if it's free just because of a preview. I haven't really dug in that far. Or they plan on offering this as a free service. That would be fantastic. My suspicion is because it's preview, it's free, and then it'll have some minimal costs. But knowing some of the cost advantages of these underlying platforms, like Azure Functions, like hosting a site on blob storage, all of this stuff is pretty cheap in general. So even if it isn't free, I'm not expecting a massive amount of costs here down the road. So it's gone ahead and synced up with my GitHub repo, and I'm going to choose my organization, which is just my organization. And I'm going to choose my repo. I've got quite a few repos in there. I want to find my joshcarlisle.io. That's important. And I want to do the master branch. Right? And we're going to go some details in the next episode around how to deal with that staging feature that I was talking about. So we have some build presets. We need to give a clue to Azure Static Web Apps what GitHub action it should be doing. Because the GitHub action for Hugo is going to look very differently than the GitHub action, for example, for Vue. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Hugo. And my app location is going to be under SRC, right? And my API location, now, if you noticed and you were really quick, we didn't have an API folder. So if I go back in and look in here, you see I don't have any API folder. Well, that's something we're actually going to get to in the second episode of this, of actually working with APIs and where we put that code for the APIs. In the meantime, we're just going to leave this alone and call it the API folder. It's worth mentioning, we're going to probably see a little warning during the build that, hey, this doesn't exist, but it shouldn't hurt our build. Now, the app artifact location, this is a little bit different. This is going to be dependent on the framework you're using. I know that by default, Hugo builds, when it builds something, it puts it into a public folder. So I'm going to go ahead and choose public here. If I don't choose public during the build sequence, it's going to toss a nasty error for us, right? But this looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. As you can see, it's pretty simple, right? I only had to have a few options, especially considering all the magic that's going on behind the scenes. So let's go ahead and hit review and create and kick this off. So the deployment, in my experience, happens really, really quick. So we'll have the deployment in progress here, and it's done. So as you can see here, we have our new Azure Static website resource created for us. We have our URL here. This is a temporary URL, White Bay. I've seen some other very interesting names in my experience here. We will obviously be changing this in the next couple episodes to be our joshcarlisle.io. We also have a little note here saying, hey, we haven't received any content for your site yet. We're going to go ahead and check that out here in a minute to see about our GitHub action and see what it's doing. It is worth mentioning we have a few options here, but not a ton of options, and that's actually probably a good thing. Configuration doesn't really come into play until we start having any of our server-side APIs. So this is configuration for our server-side APIs. We'll be setting up custom domains. Obviously, we haven't deployed any functions yet, so we don't see any functions there. We'll get into some of this environment aspects of things in the next episode, where we will introduce a staging environment and maybe do a pull request and see what that experience is like. And then we also have some various pieces for security. But let's go ahead and go back. I'm going to go ahead and open up our joshcarlisle.io, and let's go to actions here. Now, we can see here that we have a new action, and this action has already gone ahead and executed. This was actually done 3 minutes ago. So let's open this up and see what's going on in here. Great. So it looks like it's actually already gone through and it's probably already deployed it. But let's go ahead and break things down a little bit. It's doing a little bit of a setup job here and loading up some containers. So this is actually running in a container for us, the actual build process. It's going ahead and pulling all of our source code, and it's doing a build and deploy here. And we can see here that some different steps that it's going through. Here's that warning I was referring to. Warning, API directory location could not be found. That's okay. We can get past that. And then it's gone ahead and deployed our site. And then we just have some post-site cleanup and the job's complete. So this has already deployed our web app. So let's go ahead and go back to our Azure portal. And let's go back to our overview and let's copy and paste this URL. Let's see what we have here to work with. Let's close these guys. And there we go. So as you can see here, within really just a few minutes, I talked through a lot of different scenarios here, but in reality, I got an empty Hugo set up and running in just a few minutes, set up the Azure Static Web App in a few minutes, it automatically deployed in a few minutes. We had a complete setup up and running with a complete deployment pipeline in under 10 minutes, right? Now, obviously the devil's in the detail here. We need to get the site up and running. But let's go back and decompose a little bit about how this GitHub action is working. So if we go back to our repo, and we go back to our code, we'll see here that we have a new folder called GitHub Actions Workflows. It was created just 5 minutes ago. And now we have a new YAML file. And this YAML file is actually defining our GitHub action. So from here on, we do have the ability to go here and make some edits, make some tweaks, make some changes to what's going on during our build and release pipeline, if we choose to do so. I actually already have a few ideas about some enhancements I want to make, but once again, we'll circle back in another episode here to kind of voice through some of those. If you're familiar with GitHub Actions, this is no different here. So if we, for example, if we go ahead and edit this file, you'll see that we're presented with the normal GitHub Actions user interface, where we can add additional actions and make some modifications and so on and so forth. So once again, we were able to get this all up and running and get a rather empty blog, but a blog nonetheless, up and running in about 10 minutes with Azure Static Web Apps. That is one of the reasons why I was so impressed with it just a couple weeks back, when I spun up joshcarlisle.com. Like I said, I spent more time in my own content than I did in getting this up and running. So what's left? Well, we've got a lot to do. And we're going to start diving into some of those details in the next episode. We're going to probably go through and figure out how to get our content in there, right? We're definitely going to build out some APIs. We're going to figure out how to do that. We're going to go through and build some APIs for our site and show you what that experience looks like. We have some domain registration we have to do. I'm probably going to set up some DNS entries. So we still have some things remaining before we can have our full-fledged new blog up and running on joshcarlisle.io. But if there's some specific things that you would like to see, definitely leave some comments in here. I'm totally happy to kind of modify what I'm thinking here if you have some things that you would like to see. And once again, if you enjoyed this and you got some value out of this, go ahead and give this a like. And if you want to hear about when we have the next episode released, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. And until next time, thanks for joining me.